Do you ever have a franchise that just speaks to you? Something that tells you to have fun in any way that you want, to defeat enemies in any way that you want, to dress any way that you want, in a sense, to play any way you want. Something you'd base nearly your entire channel and persona around. That franchise for me is Dead Rising. What began as a concept when Capcom were storyboarding ideas for Resident Evil 4 eventually became its own franchise with a whole new cast of characters, locations, and gameplay features, as well as a much more comedic tone than Resident Evil. Even still, zombies were prioritized as the main threat, and using the power of the Xbox 360 brought a larger amount of enemies on screen than almost any other game at the time. Dead Rising was released on August 8th, 2006, exclusively for the Xbox 360. The game went on to become a giant financial and critical success, spawning 4 generations. If you couldn't guess by my previous videos, I've been a massive fan of Dead Rising for years now, and it's my favorite zombie franchise out of them all. But I feel like my first videos didn't really do the franchise justice, and my opinions have changed in some ways, but not in the ways you might be expecting. So, to celebrate the 18th anniversary of this wonderful zombie-slaying adventure, I'm going to take a look at every game in the entire series in one video. So buckle up, grab some orange juice, and enjoy my retrospective of 18 years of flesh-eating with Dead Rising. So to start off, I should mention that I kind of played this series a bit in reverse. I started with Dead Rising 3, moved back to Dead Rising 1, and then played Dead Rising 2 and Off the Record, played Dead Rising 4 when that came out, and finally played Case Zero and Case West. So my experience with this series is probably different from a lot of people who started from the beginning, but I'll try to do my best to put aside my biases for the later entries in the Dead Rising series and judge the first game on its own merits. And what better way to start out with than the story? The protagonist of Dead Rising is a freelance photojournalist named Frank West, who ventures to the town of Willamette, Colorado, hearing that something big is happening in the town. And big it is indeed. The entirety of Willamette has been infected by a virus, turning everyone into flesh-eating zombies, with most of the survivors holding up at the mall. Long story short, Frank arrives at the mall. Through the stupidest reasons ever, the zombies enter the mall. Frank runs into a safe room, and the quest to survive for 3 days begins. Right off the bat, Dead Rising presents an extremely similar concept to the 2004 remake of Dawn of the Dead, so much so that there was a legal battle amongst Capcom and Romero, which was ultimately dropped, but future copies of Dead Rising were branded with this sticker claiming it had no licensing approvals from Romero. Even still, the story of Dead Rising as compared to Dawn of the Dead makes for more opportunities to mix things up, which ultimately leads to the main gameplay aspect, using everything in the mall as a weapon. If it's not nailed down and you can pick it up, you can use it as a weapon. Everything from bowling balls to baseball bats to benches to TVs, anything is fair game, and the game puts these concepts to extremely good use. When everything clicks, this game just feels like a zombie-slaying nirvana, and the goofy atmosphere that tends to come from Capcom's 2000s titles adds to the charm of the whole thing. TJ Rotolo as Frank West. What else can I say? It's an iconic performance, and it fits the character so well that playing as him just fills me with joy. I love this guy so much, and it's a big part of what makes this game so much fun to play at times. Visually, I think the game is a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, I know that it was released in 2006 and was utilizing new technology, but even for 2006, some of these character models just look really bad. What the game is lacking in NPC detail, it makes up for in the sheer amount of zombies on screen at any time. This was a big point of marketing back in the day, and even 18 years later, the hordes in this game are still impressive. The fact that most of the time the background music is nothing but joyful mall music makes it even more atmospheric, as you have nothing but Muzak keeping you company alongside the sounds of bones crunching and snapping. Dead Rising's boss battles are also amazing, and each one of them feels different from the last, with the obvious highlight being the creepy Adam the Clown, but all of them are interesting enough that I love going back to fight them whenever they appear. And even with all of this, I'm gonna get killed for this one, the first Dead Rising does have a lot of things that infuriate me. Now listen, I admit that I have an inherent bias for the later entries in the series, but I can't shake how clunky this game feels at times. It just feels weird to play, and not in the good kind of janky way all the time. Platforming is a pain in the ass, and some of the controls are insanely weird to remember in the midst of a zombie horde. But all that compares to the main issue I have with Dead Rising 1. Every survivor is fucking brain dead. The AI in Dead Rising 1 is seriously the worst AI I've ever had to deal with in any game ever, and I'm being dead serious about that. In a game that has bad enemy AI, I can deal with that, given that at the end of the day, I don't usually suffer for it, and it usually just makes them easier to kill. But when the people I'm supposed to save have less intelligence than the goddamn zombies in a game that's focused on saving people, that is a problem! Oh my god! No, there's one other problem with this game, and anyone who's played it knows what it is. Otis is a righteous twat, and he can die in a fire. He always calls you at the most inopportune times to talk about these brain-dead morons that you have to save. And if you hang up on him because you're surrounded by flesh-eating monsters, he gets pissed off at you and has the gall to call you rude. How about you go out there and do this shit, Otis? I'd love to see your old ass out there with the zombies trying to survive. Look, for as much as I bitch about this game, though, there's one aspect I didn't always have for the game that a lot of people do, and that's the nostalgia for it. I didn't play this game when it first launched, and I played it out of order, so I do admit I don't have the best taste in my mouth from going backwards. But after going through the game multiple times now and unlocking every single achievement in the game just to try and find that enjoyment, I've realized finally that there's enough good in Dead Rising for me to absolutely recommend it. Put it simply, I think I had a skill issue. And I understand why the game is so beloved now. When everything clicks in Dead Rising, it is absolute zombie-slaying perfection. It's worth checking out and can be picked up on basically any modern system for as little as like 10 or 20 bucks, which is 20 bucks that can be spent in far worse ways. Like on Dead Rising 4. Now, after the success of Dead Rising, Capcom Japan handed over the reins to a studio based in Vancouver called Blue Castle Games for the sequel, Dead Rising 2, which was released for the Xbox 360, PS3, and PC in September of 2010, featuring an all-new protagonist, gameplay mechanic, and story. Dead Rising 2 takes place after the events of Dead Rising 1 and follows a motocross star named Chuck Green and his daughter Katie. Following an outbreak in Vegas, Katie has been infected, but luckily Isabella's formula she's used to postpone Frank's infection has been made mainstream in the form of a drug called Zombrex. Chuck enters into a game show called Terror's Reality to win money and help pay for Katie's medicine, but then the zombies used for the show are let loose, Chuck is blamed for it all, an anti-zombie killing organization called Cure gets involved, and on top of that, Chuck needs to find Zombrex to keep Katie alive. Needless to say, there's a lot going on here, and there's a lot to contend with, almost to the point that I feel like this game could have been separated into two games entirely, but I'll get to what I mean by that in a little bit. So for those of you who've been with me a while, you'll know that I had some not nice things to say about Dead Rising 2 when I first talked about it. And to be blunt, that first review, despite being the most popular video on my channel currently for some ungodly reason, seriously, what the hell, people? I love you all, but what the hell? But going back to it, has my opinion changed at all? Well, yes and also no. Let's start with the improvements that this game made to Dead Rising 1. First of all, the main characters' models are a bit better, the environments are larger, the textures are more detailed, and the game has a huge feeling of overall improvement to the presentation. The only thing I actually think objectively looks bad are the zombie models. Hell, I'd even argue that they look worse than the models from Dead Rising 1 in some aspects. Mainly the fact that they all look so similar and yet so bad. This was a similar issue in the first game, but it only seems more apparent in 2 due to how much better this game looks overall otherwise. The gore system also seems a little bit less impressive than the first game, and it looks like the character models just have their bodies Photoshop clip-tooled apart rather than actually being sliced in half. The mall music is the same and even includes some new tracks, but overall the main draw was a lot more zombies on screen and a lot more blood all over the place. Zombie hordes are way larger, and the amount of ghouls that you have to kill on the way to your objective makes it seem like you're dealing with half the amount in Dead Rising 1, because you probably were. The most notable change to the gameplay is the inclusion of combo weapons, and these are an aspect of Dead Rising that has stayed throughout the rest of the series. With Chuck being a mechanic, he has the ability to basically nail or tape things together to create new weapons entirely. From a spiked bat to a battle axe, you can basically make things that are out of the realm of realism altogether. Now, many of you know that in my original review, I did not like this game, and going back to it, I initially still didn't like it, but over the course of replaying it another time and achievement hunting, I actually also grew to love this game a whole lot more. I still don't like Chuck as much as Frank, but I grew to like him more as a character when I actually started to pay attention. Him being a hard ass kind of made him annoying at times, and I ultimately would come to like him more in another game, and again, I'll get to that in a little bit, but he is a determined father, and his lack of emotion makes total sense given how he's basically lost almost everything that meant anything to him, with the exception of his young daughter suffering with a zombie parasite inside her that will kill her without his help. Some of his skill moves felt pretty good to use, and some of them felt a little underwhelming. I will say, though, that stomp that he has, perfect. And the combo weapons were a pretty cool addition to the series, even if not all of them are very good. Survivor AI is also greatly improved, and this makes going through zombie hordes much easier. That doesn't mean that I loved everything about it, and I'm not going to jerk this game off like it's some kind of untouchable masterpiece, because there's still some things about this game that I really hate. The replacement for the convicts from the first game is an annoying bunch of snipers that are a chore to take out, because fighting enemies that carry guns in Dead Rising is a pain in the fucking ass, on top of those stupid mutated zombies that show up later into the game that charge straight towards you and vomit in your face, blinding you and leaving you open for a cheap grapple. Having to go back and give Katie Zombrex gets in the way of saving the survivors as well, so if you want to do an all-survivors rescued run of this game as well as the first game, I highly recommend looking up a guide on YouTube or something, because it'll save you a lot of time and pain that I wasted on my original couple of runs of both of these games. If you get grabbed by zombies when making a call, they can interrupt it again, but thankfully they added in a skip button. I'm also a bit upset that some of the environmental interactivity from the original game, such as Frank kicking a trash can and hurting his foot as a result, are just gone. The last thing I will mention is a problem with the remastered version of the game in particular, which is the fact that it crashes all the goddamn time, like at least every half hour or so, which always had me running to the bathrooms in the case of the game shitting itself. Overall, while I still don't love Dead Rising 2, I can still play it and have fun with it. Again, I think the nostalgia factor, something I don't have, would have helped me in my enjoyment a little more, but regardless, I feel like I was too harsh on this game the first time I took a look at it, and I definitely recommend it now, and I feel the best thing I can say is that, once again, I had a skill issue. Now, before I move on to Off the Record, as you might have expected me to, I'm going to cover the two games that I didn't cover my first time around, which are the other two games in the Dead Rising 2 saga, I guess you could call it, Case Zero and Case West. And I'm starting with Case Zero first. This is a prequel to Dead Rising 2, which came out before the base game, that takes place after the Las Vegas outbreak mentioned in that game, where Chuck's wife was killed and his daughter was infected. Chuck manages to escape to the small town of Still Creek, where his truck is stolen and he's got to find parts to put a bike together and make an escape from the town, which is, of course, infested with zombies, all while finding a dose of Zombrex for Katie. Now, gameplay is pretty simple and is pretty much the same as Dead Rising 2, but you can only level up to level 5, and there's far less combo weapons in this than in the base game. So with my somewhat rough history for Dead Rising 2, you'd probably expect me to hate this game, but I don't. I love it. I really love it. The game looks great, the controls are pretty good, the story is really well told, and Chuck is a really likable dude. Hold on a minute. I just gotta check outside to see if the fucking world is ending. So I played this after I played all the other games except for Case West, and I gotta tell you, I was expecting to hate it, but good lord, this is a really good game. I'm being genuinely serious here. This is easily one of the best games in the whole damn series. I'm not joking. So to start off with, the survivors are just as easy to escort as in Dead Rising 2, but you never really need to escort too many at once or over a big period of time. This alone makes this game so much easier to finish, and when it comes to Dead Rising games, it's probably the easiest to complete 100%. There is, however, very little to find in the world, and the game can easily be beaten in a few hours if you know what to do, but honestly, I consider it a good bite-sized dose of Dead Rising, so to speak. Chuck also gets to be the character I always wanted in this game, which is a badass, loving, caring father. He always puts Katie first, and when she's in genuine danger, he protects her. This is how I wish he was all the time in Dead Rising 2, and given the dramatic nature of the story, I can actually take this game seriously, especially due to Peter Fleming's heartbreaking performance as Chuck. None of that clearing his name crap either, that's completely gone. It's just about taking care of Katie, which is something that I actually really enjoy. Is it bad that I like this game better than Dead Rising 2 on almost every level? Because I do, and to top it all off, the game is available for the meaty sum of $5, making it perfectly priced as well. Now, that's not to say this game is perfect, because there's a few issues I have with it. For one, the game does have a few moments where it doesn't tell you exactly what's going on, and you can wind up running around all over the place looking for solutions to a problem that might not be as hard to solve if you explored the town beforehand, but that's kind of the nature of Dead Rising, so Guns still don't really feel great, but I swear to you, I think the remastered versions of 2 and Off the Record mess up the guns in some way I didn't recognize, because they feel better on the Xbox 360 than on the Xbox One, and I don't know why. On the subject of the 360, however, this is sadly the only way I've found to be able to play the game. There's no remasters or re-releases for Case West or Case Zero on PC or modern consoles, and so the only way you can play it, as far as I know, is on the 360. I don't even think that it was ever available on PlayStation, so really, if you want to play it nowadays, you better get an Xbox One or Series X and rely on backwards compatibility, because I think that's the only way that you can do it. Speaking of Case West, let's take a look at that game next. Case West is another game in Dead Rising 2's lore that carries on Chuck's story, taking place, I believe, after one of the game's bad endings in which you don't give TK his Zombrex after he gets infected and he gets into a fight with Chuck in an elevator after he's turned. Katie and Stacy have made it out alive, and just when it looks like some parasites are about to make their home inside Chuck's neck, the man of the hour comes in to save the day. After telling Chuck about a Phenotrans facility west of Fortune City, they make their way there to meet with a contact of Frank's and hopefully get some proof that Chuck wasn't behind the outbreak. Now, after how good Case Zero was, I went into this game with high expectations, and unfortunately they were not met. This is a pretty disappointing conclusion to Chuck's saga in Nevada, and I really think it could have been better if more care had been taken. So, gameplay is pretty much the same, not going to go into more detail, I've already talked about that before. Survivors save themselves upon their rescue, so that's helpful. You start at a higher level to help deal with the threats ahead, and you're gonna need it, because Case West is a bullshittingly hard game at times, mostly due to the mutated zombies all over the goddamn place, and having to fight guys with guns constantly. And I'll remind you that fighting enemies in Dead Rising games that carry guns is about as fun as getting a power drill shoved up your pee hole. The most impressive thing that this game did, however, is add an escort quest that doesn't suck, and that's Frank. He follows you throughout the facility, he's got infinite health, and there's no need to worry about him, just the way it should be. There's really not much more I have to say about Case West, other than that this is a great game to play in co-op if you got a friend, but otherwise I'd just recommend watching a playthrough on YouTube or something. Not a bad game, but definitely a disappointment. But possibly the best game in the entire Dead Rising 2 saga is Dead Rising 2 Off the Record. This is a non-canon storyline in which Frank takes Chuck's place as the main character, and with him comes a few improvements. The story follows Frank, who's feeling down and depressed after the fallout from his fame of blowing the Willamette outbreak out of the water, and enters into Terror's reality with the intention of bringing himself into the limelight again. Just like in Dead Rising 2, the zombies escape, someone is framed, and Frank does his best to uncover the story, which has a few changes here and there. Gameplay is pretty much the same as Dead Rising 2, but Frank's skill moves replace Chuck's, and he also has his camera, which was also available in Case West, but much less useful than in that game than it is here. You can use the camera to gain experience points and level up, but more importantly, Frank can use combo weapons now, and there's way more here than in any of the previous games. Not to mention, there's a few here that would come back in later games, such as a car battery attached to a sledgehammer, and I love making shit like this in Off the Record. Frank's personality makes this game so much more enjoyable to play, and he's funny as hell the whole time, on top of the fact that Zombrex can be used anywhere now, and it makes the Survivor escort missions way easier, and all of this would make it so much better by itself, if not for the single greatest inclusion to Off the Record story mode, a checkpoint system. I'm not kidding, this makes Off the Record so much more enjoyable to play, and the Survivor escort missions are made so much easier because of them. Co-op also makes a return along with an actual dedicated sandbox mode. Thank you! Overall, this game is just the best, and it's probably my favorite game with Frank in it. But there's still problems in the game that I don't like, such as the snipers and the goddamn mutated zombies. But it's better than Dead Rising 2 itself, as well as Case West, at least in my honest opinion. Is it better than Case Zero? I don't know, man, that's hard to say. Case Zero had such a good story and fantastic representation for Chuck, but I'll definitely say Dead Rising 2 Off the Record made so many improvements to the formula. But it's not Dead Rising 3. Dead Rising 3 is easily my favorite game in the entire series, and my favorite zombie game of all time. The weapons, the combat, the story, and everything else combined to make what I would call the perfect zombie sandbox game. I've already talked about Dead Rising 3 multiple times before, so I won't go too deep into it, but I'll talk about the things that make this game so special to me. In late 2015, I got an Xbox One and had the ability to try out next-gen gaming for the first time. 6 months later, I decided to pick up this game after hearing good things about about it, and I was immediately hooked. You play as Nick Ramos, a mechanic living in the town of Los Perdidos, California, and what else could throw even more panic into a hot, steamy town than an outbreak of the living dead? Nick nearly escapes death, meets up with a group of survivors that he's banding together with, and has to escape the town within 7 days or suffer death by either firebombing or getting eaten alive. Dead Rising 3 put the concept of using everything that isn't nailed down as a weapon to great effect, and I'm not kidding, there are hundreds of weapons in this game. The combo weapons make a return, and they've made them even better than in the previous games because you can create them anywhere you want. Yes! The game is so much fun to play, and the vast variety of ways to kill zombies is goddamn beautiful. There's combo vehicles now as well, and they actually just, I can't, man. I can't. The beauty! Nick is a genuinely likable dude, and more than ever, he feels like the everyman who just wants to help out. Don't get me wrong, Frank is still the best protagonist in the entire series, and Chuck is a great character too, but Nick genuinely wants to help out, and it's kind of hard to fault him as a character when he just wants to be everyone's friend. His struggles feel real, and even though what he does seems crazy, he's still a great guy. The music feels appropriately jumpy and tense and changes depending on the area you're in. The gore system is also just beautiful, and the sound of blood splattering, guts flying all over the place, and bones snapping as you tear the undead fucks limb from limb is some of the most fun I've ever had in a video game. God, I need therapy! The survivor quests are all varied, and saving them is as simple as just driving away and then they go back to the safe houses, where you can also change your clothes and pick up any weapon you found in the world. The game is just designed to have fun, and I think that's why I love it. And if the game is too easy for you, just turn on the nightmare mode and kill zombies the hard way. The game is built for any kind of zombie experience you want, and that's what ultimately makes it so great to me. There's even multiple different game modes that'll affect how long it'll take to actually beat the game and everything else. It just caters to everyone. Now, I'm not going to sit by and say that this game is perfect, because it isn't, and I feel like this game takes itself really seriously, and if you want to take it seriously, you can, but you're missing out on half the fun of the game if you do that. The co-op is fun, but unless you have someone to play with, playing with random people is a bit of a nightmare, no pun intended. I could also complain about the repetition of killing zombies, but I feel like if you're playing a zombie game in 2024, almost 2025, then repetition must not be that big of an issue for you. And like I said, there's just so many ways to end a zombie's life that it never got old for me, as well as the overabundance of zombie models in this game, making you feel like you're very rarely killing the same zombie multiple times, unless it's one that's clearly dressed to have a specific ability, like the firefighters, cops, or football players, as well as the mutated zombies that show up later in the game that are way better handled than the ones in Dead Rising 2. And it's so refreshing to see a game fit in special zombies in a way that makes sense. I think the biggest problem with this game is that there are certain weapons which to this day are day one DLC exclusive, which is just horseshit, because in order to get these things, I had to hunt down a day one edition copy of this game on eBay and hope to God the code hadn't been used. I could put up with DLC in games. I mean, I have no trouble throwing down a few extra bucks if I like the game enough, but day one exclusivity is just wrong in my eyes, and it's the single biggest problem with this game to me. It would also be wrong for me to not do what I didn't do the last time I reviewed this game, and this time I'm actually going to talk about the DLC, including the Untold stories of Los Perdidos and, give me a second. Super Ultra Dead Rising 3 Arcade Remix Hyper Edition EX Plus Alpha. Goddamn, Capcom, props for the joke. Untold Stories of Los Perdidos follows a few characters from the main game alongside Brad Park, a character who would become integral in the story of Dead Rising 4, which we'll get to soon enough. Essentially, you just play through the same map as Dead Rising 3 with a new character who also just happens to be as crafty as Nick, and there's no time limit. The gameplay is still the same as Dead Rising 3, but I found some of the stories just not as interesting as Nick's. My favorite was Brad's, as he's the only dude who you don't really see too much of during the campaign. In fact, I don't think you see him at all. And he gives you the only insight we've ever had playing as a ZDC agent. That biker dude can suck an ass, though. I hated his story. Then we've got Super Ultra Hyper Dead Rising Remix, fuck it. Then we got Super Ultra Dead Rising 3, which is a complete cluster of an arcade game, which is difficult to describe. Essentially, you play through multiple levels in different areas of the city as not just Nick, but also Frank, Chuck, and even Annie, each with your own lineup of weapons and costumes to utilize. Nick gets Ryu from Street Fighter, Chuck gets Sigma from Mega Man X, Annie gets Regina from Dino Crisis, and Frank gets a Servbot mask, and Baby Bonnie Hood from Darkstalkers as an example? Oh, okay. The game has this very cartoony, almost cel-shaded art style, but it still retains the gore, making it look like something like Borderlands or Lollipop Chainsaw, but it is really colorful, and it nails the look really well. The gameplay feels just as good as Dead Rising 3, but when the advertising says there's no time limit, I call bullshit, as each level is timed. Either way, it's another way to add more value for your purchase if you're willing to pay the extra few bucks. Unfortunately, it was never released on PC, and all I can really say to that is, why? Overall, with the overwhelming amount of stuff in Dead Rising 3, there's no way that I can't recommend it. It does things different enough from other zombie games to feel unique in its own right, while still retaining Dead Rising's core mechanics, and the amount of options to slay the brainless enemies in this game, as well as all of the DLC storylines and game modes, just makes it a must-play. Unfortunately, it was never released on PlayStation, so if you want to play it, you'll need an Xbox One, and I'm pretty sure the PC port is fixed by now or has workarounds, so please, I beg of you, try this game in some way. But now we move on to the black sheep of the franchise, and a game which I desperately need to talk about again. Dead Rising 4. Let's just jump into it. When I first saw the initial E3 reveal trailer for Dead Rising 4, I can't tell you how excited I was. I rewatched this trailer for months, getting hyped as hell, watching all the dev interviews, watching them say how they were going back to their roots, bringing Frank West back, bringing back combo weapons, setting it during the holidays, going back to Willamette, giving the camera an added touch, and just making this game look like it was the best game ever. When I initially reviewed this game 8 years ago, I gave it insane praise, saying it was my favorite game of the year, giving it all sorts of recommendations, and saying that I would recommend it to anyone, and frankly, I shouldn't have done this. Dead Rising 4 is a game that I think I loved for the sake of my hype getting to me, and even though I still don't consider it a game that I hate in the general sense, it is definitely the worst Dead Rising game when it comes to being a Dead Rising game. In terms of being a fun zombie sandbox, it's awesome, but if you're coming to Dead Rising 4 expecting the same heart and soul that was in the other Dead Rising games, you'll find less of it than you'd expect, but let's just start at the beginning. Dead Rising 4 takes place 15 years after the original game, where Frank is still traumatized by the events of the Willamette outbreak, and upon a botched investigation with a student of his, he ends up killing members of a PMC and gets a countrywide manhunt set out for him. During the next few months, Willamette plans to build the world's largest mall, and on Black Friday, the city is hit by yet again another outbreak. After being consoled by a ZDC agent named Brad Park, the same one from Dead Rising 3, Frank decides to head into Willamette one final time to get the story behind the outbreak. The story in Dead Rising 4 kind of stumbles between taking itself really seriously or just treating itself as a joke, but it ultimately just feels really muddied and not one that makes sense if you haven't played the other games. And even if you have, there are things that are going to piss you off. The characters are fine, just very, very fine. And now, I've got to address the elephant in the room. Frank West. Look, I knew this performance was doomed before the game even came out, because people didn't like the voice actor change. Putting that aside, however, there's one thing that everyone loved to throw around about Frank in this game, and it was always the same phrase every fucking time. That's not Frank. And all I have to say to those people is, did you pay attention? This totally makes sense for Frank to act like this. Taking everything as a joke makes total sense. Being a dick makes total sense because, one, I guarantee you he's trying to brush off the aforementioned trauma of being through several outbreaks and living with a terminal disease for so long, and two, literally everyone on the planet has treated him as a joke and not listened to him for close to a decade and a fucking half. It totally makes sense that he wouldn't listen to people or treat things as a joke. Another complaint is that the game is super buggy, as if the other Dead Rising games weren't buggy at all. Almost as if the first game, which everyone praises into the fucking ground, had a game-breaking bug that froze your game in Infinity Mode if you did things at specific times. And look, I played this game more than most people have, and I've only had one instance where a bug prevented me from moving forward with the main story. Not the DLC or the multiplayer, but I'll get to that in a second. Now, I don't have footage for this, but the only bug I've ever encountered that actually prevented me from making story progress, there was this one character who was supposed to be in a chair for a certain event. He ran out of the building for some weird reason and got himself killed, which forced me to restart the chapter. The only other times bugs merely annoyed me or did something stupid and gave me a chuckle. On the topic of visuals, I'm kind of mixed. I love the color palette of Dead Rising and the way that the environments look, but the actual quality of the visuals is just really, really bad, especially the zombie models and gore, which just look terrible. I'd even go so far as to say that the zombie models in this game look worse than the ones in Dead Rising 1. And even with all that, those initial trailers still made it look way better than it does now, and I don't understand why it was changed to look like this. The music, on the other hand, is goddamn perfect, and I'm being serious about this. Dead Rising 4 has my favorite soundtrack in the entire series. The big band-styled Christmas music never gets old. Hell, I've used it in a few of my videos before, and the fact that they play during the pause menu makes it that much more enjoyable if I need to pause and take a break. My favorite track in particular is a song called Oh Willamette, and I swear to you, when I first heard this in a preview, I almost thought it was some long-lost Christmas song I've never heard of. That's how good it is. As a side note, Capcom, please release the Dead Rising OSTs digitally again! But let's talk about the gameplay, because this is what really makes Dead Rising 4 different from the rest of the games. Now, let's not mince words. When this game first came out, it was in a bad state. There were no time survivor missions, and the game controlled really wonky. Now, there's dedicated survivor missions, but they're nothing special. The game's controls are somewhat better, and it's better than it was at launch, but the controls are still the worst in any Dead Rising game. Frank can now hold more weapons than ever before, but they're relegated to different buttons on the controller. Melee attacks are relegated to X, shooting is relegated to the triggers, and throwables are relegated to the left bumper, with the ability to perform a pushback attack by pressing the Y button. You can pull out your camera by clicking the right stick, and there's a bit of a stealth mechanic by clicking the left stick, where you can even pop up behind someone and pull off a selfie. And for everyone who complained that this mechanic was dumb, Frank did the same thing and off the record, and you all love that game, so shut up. There's a few new combo weapons, and there's a few new combo vehicles, some of which are more suited for the mall and some more suited for outdoors, but they just kind of feel less impactful than their previous counterparts. Dead Rising 3's combat was fast, fluid, and smooth, and everything that you used felt like it had weight to it. It was so much goddamn fun to just pick up a random object and throw it at an enemy, or to just get into combat in general. Dead Rising 4, by comparison, just feels less impactful when you hit things, and the fact that you can't throw melee weapons anymore and you also don't have a heavy attack, it just makes it feel even more unimpressive. You get exosuits to use, probably trying to keep in touch with the FPS games at the time that it had to have exosuits, but they're not too bad here. They hit hard, you can use weapons that you can't use by yourself, and you can even combine the exosuit with something in the world to get abilities. To top it all off, you get the ability to self-destruct, which is basically like firing off a mini nuke, and it never gets old. But the worst thing, the absolute worst thing about Dead Rising 4 is the boss battles, and for those wanting me to talk about them, this is why I didn't until now. In the previous Dead Rising games, there was an assortment of great boss battles, and even when they didn't hit hard, fighting them was still memorable and fun, whether it was someone like Diego in Dead Rising 3 chucking off the record, or someone as amazing as Adam in Dead Rising 1. These boss battles were engaging, challenging, and left you thinking about them long after you turned the game off. But Dead Rising 4 is like, fuck realism and people going crazy for legit reasons, or by making them interesting by basing them off of all the 7 deadly sins. Let's just put them in a stupid costume and give them a stupid name like Captain Black Friday Beard or Queen Sandra, and let's not even give them their own unique weapons or music until a year after launch, and let's just rip music from the previous games. These maniacs, are pure shells of the epic and fun boss battles Dead Rising is known for, and they're easily the worst aspect of this entire game. Other than that, maybe it's just the hundreds of hours that I've spent on this game, but replaying it, I just found it so boring. I wish I could say that I loved it as much as in my original review, but I can't. What I will talk about, though, is Dead Rising 4's extra game modes, 2 of which are DLC, and 1 of which is free. Frank Rising was released post-launch as part of a season pass, but unfortunately it doesn't matter much because this thing sucks. Look, I wanted to love Frank Rising a lot, but playing it again, I am shocked at how much I hated it. Let's start with the story, and trust me, it's probably the only good part about this DLC, so spoilers for one of the worst video game endings of all time, but Frank doesn't make it out of Willamette. He gets infected and then gets semi-cured, and then has to find a way to fully cure himself before a firebombing wipes them out. And yes, this DLC has a time limit, so all of you who wanted Dead Rising 4 to have a time limit, here you go. Enjoy it. Or don't, because it's really bad. Jeez, man. Let's just dive into the gameplay. Frank can't use melee weapons, but he can dash, scratch, roar, and puke at enemies to kill them. There's also a pounce move, but I never used it unless I had to because it left me open to attacks, and it's just so difficult to aim it. You gotta collect what Frank calls princess wasps to fully upgrade your zombie abilities, but some of these challenges are just so unfun that it literally sucked the enjoyment out of my body to the point where I literally had a 1,000-yard stare the moment where I just crumpled, and I literally said to the people in my Discord call at the time, "This sucks." And here I am telling you it sucks. Now, combat against the zombies isn't terrible, but fighting human enemies as Zombie Frank, especially on any difficulty above easy, is literally some of the worst melee combat I have ever experienced in any video game. I've already said how combat against enemies with guns in Dead Rising games is bad, but seriously, it's just the worst in this DLC. It's about as fun as John McClaning your feet. The bad endings suck, and the good endings suck less, but it's just a bad experience all around. There was literally a bug that plagued this game for a few weeks or so that prevented you from beating it. I don't even want to talk about it anymore. Let's move on to mini golf. Super Ultra Dead Rising 4 mini golf was added later and is actually, no joke, the best part of this entire game. There's a ton of customizations for the characters you can play as, the courses are all fun, there's a great amount of creativity in them, and there's a lot to do here. Other than that, it's mini golf. I like the banter commentary between Frank and a zombie co-host he's abducted that he calls Bob, and it's fun to play and is probably a blast with friends, more so than the other lackluster co-op multiplayer mode that was put in this game that nobody's playing anymore. But it's a shame that it's locked behind a season pass for a game that, let's be honest, nobody cares about it anymore, and that's a painful realization I've had to come to terms with over the last 5 years, guys, and it gets more painful every single day. Finally, there's the Capcom Heroes mode that launched with the game's release on PS4, and this mode is fine. You play through the main story with the ability to use these arcade cabinets that can give you costumes and abilities of various Capcom characters, probably leftover assets from Super Ultra Dead Rising 3. Dante's the most fun to play as because of course he is. There's no weapon pickups, you're limited to 3 healing items, it's just fine. Look, if it isn't obvious enough by this point, I've gotten so tired of this game over the years, and I've played it to death. I've exhausted every single good point out of it that I can, and I'm just tired of it. I wanted this game to be so much more than it was, but it wasn't. I was blinded by hype, and even though this game is pretty fun when you just treat it as a zombie sandbox game, it's not a good Dead Rising game, and the music is where most of the soul from this game is going to stay for me. When I think back on this game nowadays, I always think of this particular cutscene that I have on screen right now. It's an animated cutscene with a beautiful rendition of "Oh Christmas Tree" playing in the background, and it details the events that take place in between the 6 weeks before Frank returns to Willamette. It is an artistic masterpiece across the board, and I keep thinking that if the rest of the game got as much care and polish as this 1 minute long cinematic, it could have been the best game in the entire series, but sadly, it just wasn't meant to be. And with that, we come to the current ending of Dead Rising. So after Capcom Vancouver's shutdown, the future of Dead Rising still hung high in the air for around 7 years. But recently we got the announcement of a complete remake of Dead Rising 1 coming out sooner than ever, titled Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster. And I seriously think that not calling it Deluxe Remake was a huge missed opportunity, considering it looks so good and worthy of that status. But regardless, I just want it to do good. Resident Evil managed to crawl out of the gutter after 3 games which tanked the series' reputation, with one fantastic game that made everyone remember why they loved the RE series to begin with. My hopes were shattered initially with the announcement of Capcom Vancouver's closure, and I have practically been suffering for these last 7 years chasing that same high that I got from Dead Rising's gameplay. But it looks like when we eventually see Frank coming back in September, we will see a resurgence in Dead Rising. Maybe we'll get a Dead Rising 2 Deluxe Remaster in the future. I have no idea. That's way too far into the future to even begin to think about right now. The only thing I know for sure is I'll be back in Willamette on September 19th, and I'll be front and center for telling you whether or not this game is worth your money. Until then, thank you all for taking this trip down memory lane with me. It just amazes me that some of you might have been following me since I was a nerdy little shit in high school, and now I'm a nerdy big shit who has a job, and I'm still here talking about one of my favorite game series. I guess time really does fly. And even though the future is uncertain, one thing is certain for me. I am having fun again. I will see you all later with the continuation of my RGG retrospective, and make sure to keep calm and cover wars. Have a good one, folks.
It feels like Christmas time all through the year. Oh, Willamette, I won't let you forget all the good times we've had, right? Whoa, Willamette.
Let's go gambling! Aw, dang it! Aw, dang it! Aw, dang it!